The Marvellous Mrs. Maisel is a hugely successful TV show. We can follow Midge Maisel, who is the perfect housewife in New York of the 1950s, until she realizes that her husband has been cheating on her with his secretary, and while her life completely falls apart, she discovers her passion for stand-up comedy. I really enjoyed watching this show because we can see what life was like in New York in the 1950s, what was the situation of women in the 1950s, and I also really enjoyed following Midge's path from housewife to stand-up comedian to megastar. And she's not the only woman that we can follow. There's also Rose, her mother, who becomes more and more emancipated, and also her manager, Susie. And also the fashion is marvelous. I really love the costume design, and I wanted to take a closer look and also see what we can learn from Mrs. Maisel about the 1950s fashion. But before I start with the details, some housekeeping here. This is a non-sponsored post. I'm just sharing my personal opinion and my research here. And to understand the fashion, we also need to understand what was going on overall at the time. And just to clarify something here, I'm focusing on the first 3 seasons of Mrs. Maisel because these 3 seasons cover the 1950s. In season 4 and 5, we have more time periods that are covered, and then it gets quite a lot, and it would have been too much for one video, and I didn't want to make one super long video, also squeeze too much into one video. But if you're interested in another video about season 4 and 5, let me know in the comments below and then I will prepare one. So basically these first 3 seasons are from fall 1958 until roughly 1961. And when we look at the fashion, they don't really reference one particular year. It's more certain styles. So when we look at the beginning of the show, it's rather the earlier 50s that we see represented, and then the more we progress, we also see the new developments. And especially in season 3, in the last scene, we see Midge in an outfit that already represents the 1960s, which had already started, and the fashion that the decade will bring. I already mentioned this, the show is set in New York, and we can learn a lot also about New York's history in the 1950s. So overall, the atmosphere in New York at the time was rather positive. It was post-war, but there was already this outlook of the economic miracle. And when it comes to New York, what also contributed to this economic upswing of the 50s, of course, is also the garment district. And we are even taken to the garment district with the Maisel family because Midge's husband, or later ex-husband, he works in the family factory in the garment district, and we see how people worked there at the time. What is also a core focus in the show is the situation of women in the 1950s. I mentioned this already in other videos. The 1950s, not only in America, also in Europe, were kind of a backwards development for women's rights, also the women's movement, because during the war, a lot of women had started to enter the workforce because the men were fighting the war. They were back at home and they still had to make ends meet and earn a living. So they went to work. That's why also fashion became more practical. But after the war, with the 1950s and this economic upwards development, it again became fashionable to stay at home, be a homemaker, the housewife, the perfect housewife, like Midge in the beginning is. This was the ideal. But what we also see is the flip side of this. In a lot of countries, women could not live freely. For a lot of things, they needed the approval of their husband, father, or brother, for example, to take up work. Also, pants were not really accepted everywhere. So this is also something that we very much see in the show Mrs. Maisel. And also Midge Maisel's style is very much this. We have this hourglass silhouette, the typical dresses that she wears. One detail that I would like to say is that we see upper class New York here. So this is the fashion in New York for the people who had more money. This was probably not what we saw in the countryside or in other areas, and also for people who did not have access to the clothes. And just to explain this to you, we see the lifestyle of Midge Maisel's family. Her father works at university, her mother has this typical social life of a housewife in the 1950s, and also for these events you needed a certain type of attire, which was very much codified at the time, and they were also very much interested in fashion and they could afford it. They dropped names like Chanel, Jacques Fat, so it's quite common for them, but I would just like to remind you, this is one certain part of society. This was not the life that everybody led in the 1950s. And we see that Midge, like her mother, is very much interested in fashion. They have countless closets full of clothes. We also see her in a scene where she reads Vogue. The vintage Vogue magazines were also the inspiration for the costume designer, and Midge also wears the typical silhouette, so she wears corsets and girdles because we see her in this signature hourglass shaped with a wide A-shaped skirt, but also in the fitted pencil line or this rather en huit look also by Dior. The costume designer for the show was Donna Sukovska, and I really appreciate what she did for the show. I also read her book Madly Marvellous, where she describes the costume design of the show in a lot of detail. I can only recommend this book. And she actually made 98% of the garments herself with the team. So a bit of the garments, or a small fraction of the garments, was vintage, also the accessories, but a lot of the things that you see on the show were specifically made for the show. And Sukovska shares in her book that when she has a project, she tries to surround herself with as many things possible from the times. So I already said before, vintage Vogue was a big influence. She also looked into photographs from the time to just recreate this Maisel universe. And they made the costumes either at Steiner Studios in Brooklyn or in the Garment District, which I find really nice, the link also to the show and the history of New York. And when they then had the design, Eric Winterling brought the outfits to life and Lynn Mackey made the hats. And when I say 98% of the outfits, I'm not only talking about Midge Maisel, I'm talking about everyone in the show. And there was an insane amount of extras for the show. And also Sukovska created the costumes for all the extras. And she focuses a lot on the details, so also for the extras and the backgrounds. I will go into the details a bit later. So this is something that I really appreciated. And what happened to all of these costumes after the show? Some of the actors took the costumes. For example, Rachel Brosnahan, who is Mrs Maisel in the show, she took some of the costumes, and Sukovska said she really appreciated this because she had a very good relationship with the actress. And together they worked on the outfits, they brought them to life, and Sukovska even said this is some part of the work that she is going to miss most. This is the fittings with Rachel Brosnahan. Now let's look into the details. There are countless outfits of Midge Maisel, so I only selected a few of them, otherwise the video would have been even longer than it already is. And I grouped all the outfits into three categories. The first one is daytime attire, which means when she is at home at the Upper West Side, also when she goes downtown for certain events, for example. The second group is Occasionwear. What is this? Today we mainly think of weddings, for example, but because she was very much part of social life of the Upper West Side in the 1950s, there were many events that required certain clothes, so it was very codified, so you had special attire for special occasions. And the third group is her stage costumes and how this stage costume basically developed over time. So when we look into the daytime attire, the first thing that I want to discuss is the colors. It's very subtle, but the colors in Mrs. Maisel are deliberate. They all have a meaning, or most of them have a meaning. I found this very interesting because only when I read more about the show did I realize all these color combinations. And this is very much aligned with Donna Sukovska's approach to costume design because she sees scenes in terms of colors. And when we think of Mrs. Maisel, what is the first color coming to mind? It's probably pink, because this was also the color that was used to promote the show. And when we think about pink, it's probably this pink coat from the pilot. And pink then comes up in a lot of shades. At first, Sukovska actually mixed the shade of pink herself, and then pink all along these 5 seasons always shows up in different shades, in magenta, in fuchsia, in salmon, coral. So we see a lot of pink, and sometimes we don't even notice the pink anymore because it's done very subtly. For example, on her first day at B. Altman, she wears an ensemble, and then the trims at the collar and the cuff are in pink. When she is at court, she wears pink underneath her collar, so obviously this gives her confidence. And where does this pink come from? It actually relates to her past, the seemingly happier times when everything was still great with her husband also, this kind of rosy picture that is being painted. But over time, this color, like Midge, transforms. And this is very interesting because instead of abandoning pink because it stands for this perfect nostalgia, they actually use pink and turn it into Midge Maisel's confidence color. It's as strong as Midge becomes over time. And I find this really interesting that they use this color that is very often criticized. Pink is just for girlies, and as a feminist woman, you can't wear pink. They actually play exactly with that. And actually, one of the briefings for the role was that Midge Maisel should never look defeated. We also never actually see her depressed. Yes, there are some difficult times where we see her, but somehow she still holds on to this positive outlook, maybe this rosy outlook, and maybe the color pink stands for exactly that. And pink is not the only color. Another very dominant color that also comes to my mind when I think of Mrs. Maisel is green. There was this signature green coat, and actually green stands for Midge's heroic side. So every time when she does something very heroic, basically, she wears green. And even if it's by accident, because she passes by Washington Square and suddenly by chance she becomes the voice of the women's movement, she also wears green for that. Or there is an element of green every time when she stands up to someone. So this is also very interesting. White is used every time when one chapter closes and there's some kind of renewal. And when she needs that extra amount of confidence, it's a very intense color version of pink, as I said before. Like, for example, this very intense magenta coat that she refers to with her mom, where she said it's Jacques Fat. This is when she goes to see her lawyer, which is also quite intense, very eccentric, but this gives her confidence, and this is the signature Maisel style. When we see the flashbacks to her wedding, the bridesmaids are in a very soft green, the guests are in cream tones, then we have the band in salmon pink, and she herself is the center, of course, in this wedding dress. And the wedding dress is actually something I would like to point out now, even though it's occasion wear. It's actually very special because it did not correspond to the popular wedding dresses of the time. When you look up 1950s wedding dresses, some say the American wedding dresses at the time were these like cake style, tiered cake style dresses. They were really big. Midge Maisel's dress was actually the opposite of this, very tuned down, and for the flamboyant Mrs. Maisel, very quiet, but it was very fashionable because this dress was actually a replica or inspired by the dress of Audrey Hepburn in Funny Face. When she gets married in Givenchy, so this dress was actually inspired by that movie. And I would like to come back to the color green and how it connected the nostalgia from the past and the current situation. There's a flashback to a New Year's party where Midge wears a green dress with the signature bell-shaped skirt. And then it morphs into the current version, which has a different silhouette, but it's also green. So we have the nostalgia, everything was happy, and then Midge is in this apartment, which is empty, but it already shows how heroic Midge is for stepping up for herself, for taking over the responsibility by using the color green. And to achieve this effect, they used a special camera effect, and they had to make two dresses with the same back top, so that they could kind of morph those two dresses into each other. And when we look at Midge's life, especially the uptown scenes, it feels like Rose and her live in a bubblegum reality. Everything is colorful and pastel colored. For example, when they go to the gym, it's this really cute outfits. And somehow this gives us this feeling of like the perfect life, but we know already Midge's life is not perfect. It probably has never been, and particularly now it's not. And also Midge herself is not perfect. She's very outspoken, she's very emotional, she can get very loud, dramatic. She is the complete opposite of what is actually expected from the perfect Upper West Side housewife. But this makes her so charming. I think this makes her so relatable, and it also reminded me a bit of Cher in the movie Clueless, because both live a life which is not achievable for most people. They have this upper class life, but somehow the viewers can relate to these characters because despite their background, they are still very relatable. And the signature garment, when we think about Mrs. Maisel, is probably the coat. This coat is this typical swing coat from the time, and this was not unusual because this silhouette was very practical, because you could wear any silhouette you wanted underneath. It made the coat very flexible, and in the case of Mrs. Maisel, she has a full rainbow of coats. I actually really love them. I wish there were still more coats around like at the time, because at the moment I find most of the coats really boring, but that's a different story. And this signature Mrs. Maisel coat in pink made it into the Smithsonian Institution. It is part of the collection at the National Museum of American History, next to Dorothy's red slippers and also Superman's cape. I mentioned the signature 1950s silhouette a lot, and as we know, this silhouette is achieved only by wearing certain undergarments. And what I really appreciate about the show is that the costume design looked at every single detail, and they knew you can only achieve an authentic 1950s outfit if you also wear the underwear. So corsets, girdles, bras, all of this was either sourced vintage or recreated. I read that Donna Sukowska ended up with one special bra for Rachel Brosnahan. Of course, these bras had to be pointed to also achieve the signature silhouette, and they also made a special corset. The inspiration came from haute couture, because this corset had to be a bit more flexible, because Rachel Brosnahan spent a lot of time in that corset, long days, and it had to be more flexible than the normal corset of the 1950s. And of course, they also used petticoats underneath the skirts to achieve this opulent skirt shape. And petticoats actually were not meant to be seen. Still, the ends of the petticoats very often had details like trims or laces, because sometimes when you moved, for example, when you danced, sometimes you could see the petticoat peeking out underneath. And then there's one scene where Midge is on stage and she drops basically onto the sofa doing her stand-up comedy, and you see the petticoat underneath. So you can already see the undergarments that had to be created for the show. And what is very important also for Midge Maisel's look is the accessories, because at the time in the 1950s, for her lifestyle, the accessories had to match the outfit. So you had to have a matching hat, the bag, the shoes. Remember, I said this in my other video about Coco Chanel. She came up with this two-tone shoe because she wanted to give women the option to have a shoe that fits to more than just one dress. But the standard at the time was that you had a dedicated shoe to a dedicated dress, for example. And similar also the hat or the handbags. The handbags had much shorter handles, so you could carry them basically like this on your hand. The bags that you could carry over your shoulder, allowing you more freedom, came up later. Again, also Coco Chanel influenced this with her 255 bag. So all of this is perfect for Midge's world uptown, but when she goes downtown, she can't really wear those outfits. She sometimes does, but even then, they are already adapted for the lifestyle downtown, because when we go to places, for example, Greenwich Village was very much inspired by the Parisian bohemians, also by the beatniks. The colors were very different, like it was more darker colors. So we see that even with Midge, who is usually very colorful. Usually the outfits for her downtown life are darker. She also wears fitted tops, and then she switches the bell-shaped skirts to trousers, capri trousers, which was very daring at the time, but people in Greenwich Village wore them. Maybe you did not wear that too much for a function on the Upper East Side, but in the art spaces of downtown, this was very fashionable. So Midge is kind of like a social chameleon, and she also does this. And if you have watched my other video about the capri pants, you already know that these pants stand for the women's movement, for women's empowerment. So this is also something that we see kind of transported in Midge Maisel's style. And Midge kind of oscillates between uptown and downtown, so her wardrobe kind of has to work for both places. And sometimes she wears something that could work uptown but also downtown. For example, in one of the Washington Square scenes, she wears this ensemble where when we look at it, we can't really tell is it now uptown or downtown. What I find really interesting are her outfits for the downtown art scenes. For example, she goes to a gallery opening and she wears this black and white dress with floral appliques, so very feminine, but then there's one detail, it has a bubble shape, and this is a hint already at avant-garde. Bubble shape was very much fashion forward. It was nothing that you would see at a tea party uptown. I think this was more accepted downtown, and also shows this side of Midge Maisel. And then also similarly, the costume designer had to think of the setting. For example, when she goes to the studio of Declan Howell, the artist, they had to give her an outfit that kind of blended into the chaos of the studio. So she wears this blue dress with the green details that works really well with all the art stuff behind her. The more time Midge Maisel spends on stage, the more her outfits are also influenced by the stage. They become more theatrical. And I think the best example is this red dress for Yom Kippur. It's red. So first of all, it's a challenge to her ex-husband Joel. And then from the dinner, she goes directly to the Gaslight and does an impromptu performance. This is the dress that I mentioned before with the petticoat. And it shows kind of like what is going to come for Midge for her career. And we can also see how her stage outfits, what they are going to look like. Maybe not in red, maybe in another color, which I'm going to discuss later. But this already shows a new step in Midge Maisel's career and also life. And this dress is then taken up and referenced throughout later episodes and seasons. And just one note, the Gaslight actually really existed on MacDougal Street. The concept was a bit different, but you can already see how the makers of the show also tried to involve what was actually happening in New York into the show. Midge Maisel's work attire is also very interesting because when she starts to work at B. Altman, of course, there is kind of a uniform style in the clothing. She tries to blend in with the ladies on the sales floor, and she wears these ensembles. Sometimes there is kind of a twist. For example, we see a lot of polka dots. We see, for example, flower details that are also relating to the seasons, but it's not too much of Midge Maisel's character herself. Donna Zuchowska said the main inspiration for the work attire for Mrs. Maisel at B. Altman was Auntie Mame, when in 1958 Mame works on the sales floor at Macy's, so this is the major inspiration, and it is this glamorized image of the working woman. She still looks very perfect and very cute. This changes a bit when Midge is sent to basement hell to work at the switchboard. She kind of blends in also with the switchboard ladies because the colors are more earthy, brick tones, for example, and there are a lot of stripes. And this is on the one hand that Zuchowska said she discovered pictures of switchboard rooms and some ladies were wearing stripes, so this inspired her, but it's also the stripes relate to the switchboard. So we see that her work attire becomes more Mrs. Maisel when she comes back from the tour with Shy that ended early, and then she has to work again. But this time she works for a radio show, and then we see that she actually does not really care that nobody can see her. So the first outfit is still very much Miami inspired. It's very eccentric. Susie even makes a comment that she said, like, it doesn't matter what you wear, you're on radio. But for Midge Maisel, of course, it does matter. And then she really shows her character, even though she only speaks for the radio. Let's move to the second category, the occasion wear. And in the case of Mrs. Maisel, occasion wear also means the attire for traveling. So there's one big trip to Paris when she tries to get Rose back to New York. At first, she leaves in something that is kind of reminding us of a stewardess's uniform. It's the first time that Mrs. Maisel is ever on a plane, so we see that excitement. And then we see the second outfit for Paris, which was actually inspired by Monet's water lilies. It's in these pastel colors, and she wears that for a very long time for a lot of scenes, so she had to blend in because it even had to work with the drag queens on stage, which looked very glamorous. There were a lot of sparkles, sequins, and all of this, and she kind of performs with them on stage. And in Paris, they also had to work with this extras challenge. There were a lot of extras involved to bring the city to life. And Paris in the 1950s, the fashion was very different, way more codified than in New York. It was heavily influenced also by work uniforms that Zukowska then also took as inspiration. So we have a lot of jewel tones with the extras, and this makes Mrs. Maisel pop and stand out from the crowd. But when it comes to traveling and occasion wear, it's probably the trip to the Catskills that shows this, because we see Midge in one of the first scenes before they go in this floral dress in yellow, where she screams, "We are going to the Catskills," and she's really excited. It's the first time that we see Midge in florals. And then we see a lot of different outfits during that holiday, and they are always matching the activity. And in the 1950s, these types of clothes were called play clothes. So we could say it was the active wear of the 1950s. And one American designer had a big impact on that. This was Claire McCardell. I hope I said the name correctly. And there's actually a reference to the designer in the show, because Midge's mother, Rose, wears a dress in the Catskills, which is an almost exact copy of a dress by Claire McCardell. An interesting detail is that Midge's and Rose's clothes, they kind of match each other, even though it's not literally that it's very, very similar. One very similar example is the floral dresses when they go to the hairdresser, but even when they do a bicycle trip, for example, or when they are at the resort, very often they are matching elements. And one of the most interesting outfits is this kind of play suit that Midge wears when she goes boating with Benjamin. It's this striped garment that was actually made of vintage fabrics, and then it opens up in the front, and you can kind of see green shorts. It could also be part of a full suit, an overall, for example. And this was actually called play suit at the time. These play suits were inspired by children's rompers, and it was very common that you had something over it, sometimes even in the same fabric. Midge's is different because it's a different fabric. It looks very different, but it still matches the whole outfit. She also has a straw hat. She has some kind of espadrilles, if I saw it correctly. So it's this signature summer look that's very typical of the time, and it has this special Mrs. Maisel touch. We also see Mrs. Maisel in a bikini when there is this beauty pageant. Her bikini is different from the others because it's blue with polka dots. It's also inspired by Mamie Van Doren, and it makes her stand out from the crowd. Again, we also see that she is a special character, probably a bit more fashion forward than the others. And then we also see a lot of evening wear. Naturally, because there are a lot of evening events in the Catskills. Who went to the Catskills? Upper class, in the case of Mrs. Maisel, the Jewish families, they went to spend the summer outside of the stuffy city, and of course they then also had evening events. And I would like to point out one dress. It was inspired by a perfume from the time called Evening in Paris. It's in shades of blue with silver appliques, so we can imagine you walk down the roads in Paris at night, you see the blue sky with the stars, so it's very melancholic, and it also shows the end of the family holiday. When Midge starts to see Benjamin, we also see a different side of her. She is a bit more daring, a bit more seductive, but always the right amount of it. For example, she wears the shorts when they go back to the city, and needless to say, at the time shorts was very daring, but her shorts are just the right amount. It's not too much. And for her first real date with Benjamin, she wears a dress again, which is reminding us of this Yom Kippur dress, but it's a bit more feminine, a bit more seductive, and it again stands for her independence. Needless to say, all her accessories have to match. Even Benjamin makes a comment on that. This is very Mrs. Maisel, but as I said before, it was also part of the fashion understanding or the fashion style at the time. Midge also takes Benjamin to the stage deli. The delis at the time were a big part of the theater district in New York. So you really had a stage deli, and there was a competition between that deli and the Carnegie deli. So again, this is a hint at how detailed the show actually is. And what's interesting is that at these delis, of course, you had the theater crowd, so eccentric people with a certain style. But when Midge is there, she still stands out from the crowd. For example, when she takes Benjamin there, she wears this orange dress with the flowers, with the matching hat, which really stands out in the crowd. This is also due to her silhouettes. And this is exactly what Żuławska tried to achieve, to make Mrs. Maisel stand out even in a very eccentric crowd. And let's go back to the traveling, because when Midge goes on tour, with Shy, she goes to Las Vegas and to Miami. She doesn't travel light. Susie comments on that. And Las Vegas at the time is more than just another gambling resort. It already had established itself as a very glitzy entertainment hub in the US, but it also had a reputation globally. And slowly we can see how these elements of glitzy Las Vegas also influenced Mrs. Maisel's style. We have this telephone scene also linked to the teddy bears in the room, where she wears this, I would say, orange colored dress with a golden belt, where we can already see the reference to the casinos, the glitzy entertainments of Las Vegas. What I like even more is the outfits for Miami, because it shows Miami in the 1950s and 60s. It was a very happening place already back then. It was very maximalist. The Fontainebleau Hotel really existed. Frank Sinatra or the Rat Pack stayed there, so it was already a hub for celebrities. Even the staircase to nowhere really existed, and it actually led to an insignificant room. I don't know what was in there, but the guests loved to parade down the stairs and show off their garments. We even also see this in the show. And when it comes to the outfits for Mrs. Maisel, they are also maximalist, colorful patterns, even more colors than what we usually see. And also the patterns, for example, this parrot skirt that she wears is very much Miami. And also when she arrives in Miami, she wears this interesting dress. If I remember correctly, it's hand painted, and usually when we see Mrs. Maisel, we expect her to be in a coat. But Miami, it's way too hot for a coat, so Żuławska gave her a cape, and this makes Midge Maisel look even more heroic. And of course, what does Midge do when she arrives? She immediately heads to the pool. Susie is not really a big fan of it, and the briefing for Midge was also that she should look cute in that scene. So Żuławska created this bathing costume, which is relatively simple. It has this pink bow at the top, but then she also wears a big straw hat, which looks like an open shell. And when you see it from the top, there were actually stripes on it. And this kind of reflects the umbrella that Midge is sitting underneath. So what I really, really like is that Żuławska created this circus-like atmosphere. She also said it's Miami, but with a Caribbean twist. So we see all of this in the elements, and Midge Maisel wouldn't be Midge Maisel if she didn't even stand out in that circus. She always kind of blends in, but then she also at the same time stands out. So like, for example, the parrot dress is typical of this Miami style. It's very loud, but still very much Mrs. Maisel. And then when she goes on this boating trip, she wears something that's actually quite accepted to wear for a boating trip. She wears pants and a striped jumper. It's this typical fisherman's jumper that we also know from France, from Coco Chanel. But there is a small detail there. There are also orange stripes. So she knows the codes, but she also plays with them and then turns the garments into her own style, and basically with this stands out from the crowd. Now let's look into her stage outfits. The signature stage outfit is from her first official performance, a black dress. And the challenge was that Midge Maisel had to come across as this typical housewife who happens to be a stand-up comedian. It somehow had to work. So the easiest solution was this black dress. And some people say it's a stage uniform, but uniform is actually not the correct term, because this dress then evolves over time. We see different silhouettes, different shapes. We also see details like laces, rhinestones, belts, all of this. And we could say it's rather unified than uniform, but it becomes the signature Mrs. Maisel look on stage. And this first dress is yet another reference of Audrey Hepburn. In Sabrina, she wears this dress with the bows at the shoulder, which are exactly also on Mrs. Maisel's dress. Also the shape is similar, and also the neckline, because this boat neckline is very often called Sabrina neckline. So this is taken up, and one of the creators of the show actually said that she wanted a black dress for Midge, and that she wanted to pair it with pearls. And then this is actually taken up in the show because Rose tells her this dress needs pearls without knowing where her daughter is actually going. Another thing that's very interesting, it's a detail, is the shoes, because Mrs. Maisel wears black pumps with the outfit with a stiletto heel. And this was a rather new development, because before most of the heels were block heels, and in the 1950s there was a new technique with steel inside that the stiletto could support the foot. This was heavily promoted by Salvatore Ferragamo, for example, and we know Mrs. Maisel is fashion forward, so she already wears this type of shoe. And this dress with the signature silhouette not only reflects the popular new look at the time created by Christian Dior, it also shows a social phenomenon, because it's a cocktail dress. And why did these dresses become popular? Where did they get the name from? Because the cocktail hour became very, very popular, and then you needed a special dress for it, and hence the cocktail dress with the signature length was created. I would like to point out two beauty-related details, even though I focus on the fashion, but at the time the hairstyle and also the makeup heavily contributed to the overall fashion style. So one thing I would like to point out, she always has this signature Mrs. Maisel look, and we see in the show that she uses special rubber rollers. They made it easier at the time to sleep with them, because as we see, it's quite a comedic scene. She sleeps with the rollers without her husband actually knowing that she uses them. And then another thing that's very interesting is that she points out a special shade of lipstick. She refers to Revlon's Cherries in the Snow. When she's at B. Altman, there's this lady who looks for a special type of red, and this is the red that Mrs. Maisel recommends to her. I read somewhere that the shade is still available for purchase. I did not see it on any websites here in Austria, but maybe if you live in the US or somewhere else, you can check if Cherries in the Snow is still available online. It was a hugely popular shade, so this is yet again another detail that Zuchowska took up and put into the show. And as I already said, her black dress evolves over time. We have a version in Las Vegas with a big bow on the shoulder and kind of a comedic hairstyle. It's the first time that we see Midge in such a hairstyle, but it kind of balances out the big bow on the dress. And then we see Las Vegas influences her, because we see rhinestones, for example, on the dress. And over time, we also see a bit of color, because for her performance at the Fontainebleau, there are suddenly these pink feathers. And then there's also another dress that incorporates green elements. So again, the color of confidence, the heroic color incorporated in her stage dress. But for the majority of performances, Mrs. Maisel performs in black only. But we see those details every time when we see this is Mrs. Maisel's path to her own empowerment, we could say. The only exception for the performance is the pink dress that she wears for her performance at the Apollo. The Apollo was a very important part of Harlem and also Harlem's culture scene. It still is until today. In the 1950s, it was very upscale, but at the same time, it also had a community feel to it. And again, Midge Maisel is an opening act for Shy Baldwin, and she wears this pink dress. Again, she needs this boost of confidence, because we can see this is different from her previous performances at the Gaslight or also on tour. This is something really big. And she also wears a coat that we can say it's maybe even a kimono style coat with it, also with pink. So we see that this stands for her new life, also for her new confidence. And again, she wears pink for this. And with this, I've also reached the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed this video, even though it was one of the longer ones. This video has been in the making for quite some time, and I did a lot of research for this because I really enjoyed the costumes, and there are so many details that I wanted to share with you. So I'm also really curious what you think of the show. Did you like it as much as I did? What did you think of the fashion? Do you have any other outfits that you particularly liked? Please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and if you learned something, there are 2 ways to show me that you liked it. First, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already, and also don't forget to hit that like button. If you prefer to read about fashion, you can read fashion-related articles on my website, thepinklookbook.com, and you can also check out my fashion label Pelagona if you like. And if you like this time travel to the 1950s, I have another video for you where we travel to the 1970s and where I analyze Maria Callas' style. Thank you very much for joining me in this video, and see you in the next one.